The church finds itself at a crossroads. Many of us sense this in a profound way, and we're trying to discern the leading of the Holy Spirit and how we help navigate the church into the future. There are a lot of voices chiming in, some saying that the church needs to be conservative, some saying that the church needs to be liberal. So which is it? As the culture shifts around us, what kind of church should we be? I want to challenge you that neither of those labels, conservative or liberal, is strong enough to capture the mystery that is the church of Jesus in the world. I want to challenge you with a different idea. I believe that we need to be the radical church. We need to be the radical church. Now, that word might make you uncomfortable, because maybe you think when you hear the word radical, you think about a political agenda, or you think about being on the extreme edge. But that's not actually what the word radical means. It comes from a Latin word, radix, which means root. To be the radical church means to return to our roots, to rediscover our roots. And as we sink down into the memory of who we have been and who we were called to be since the beginning, that memory will ignite our imagination as we look at the future. Throughout the New Testament, the word that we translate as church is this Greek term, Eekklesia. Now, when the early church used this term to describe itself, they didn't make this word up. They borrowed it out of the Greek language. It already existed. And because the word already existed, it was already invested with layers of meaning. Oftentimes it's translated as assembly or gathering, but the root idea of this term ecclesia is this definition. Ecclesia means called out ones. This is who the church is designed to be, our ancient calling since the beginning. Right here, embedded in this idea, is the DNA of a radical church. Let's pull this apart word by word. I'm going to start with this word called. When we think about the idea of called in the New Testament imagination, immediately we get this imagery of discipleship, right? We think about Jesus walking along the side of the lake and calling the disciples, come, follow me. Drop your nets, leave the life you have behind, and come follow me. The idea of discipleship. We're going to use the letter D to represent that. Then we've got this word out. Now this is important because this sets the whole trajectory for this entire idea. Where are we being called to? Of course, we know we're being called to join God in His work. But where is God? If you believe that God is in one sacred space and He's waiting there for you on one sacred day, one sacred hour out of the week, then that's going to define your entire idea of Christianity. But if you capture this idea that God is out at work in every corner of creation, He's already moving and He's calling us out to join Him in that work, then that will change our entire idea. And we believe when we talk about this word out, it represents that idea, the idea of mission. We're going to use the letter M to represent that, to join God in His mission in the world. And then we have this word ones. Ecclesia is a plural idea. It is a communal idea. We are in this together. Now we understand that Christianity is an intensely personal faith. Nobody else can make that decision to follow Jesus for you. Nobody else can surrender for you. It's intensely personal. But from its beginning, it has been centered around this idea of community. Community, discipleship, and mission happening in this context of community. Even when Jesus calls the disciples, He doesn't only call one, right? He calls a group of them and He forms a community around Himself from the very beginning. Discipleship, mission, community. Run DMC, all right? It always comes back to old school rap for me. There you go. So our initial reaction when we begin to think about this, when we think about this framework of discipleship, mission, and community is we say, okay, let's create some programs that can get that rolling. So some people will be on the discipleship track, right? And then others, like our activists among us, the people who want to go out, well, they'll be on the mission track, or extroverts will be there. And then the others who really care about community, well, they'll get engaged on the community track. But that is not the way that Jesus did discipleship. Instead, the way Jesus did it was he had all of these ideas intertwined together, moving together. They're crossing over each other. They are inseparable. Discipleship and mission happening together in this context of community. This is the way he did it. Yes, we've got the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus teaches us, and so we sit under that teaching and we soak it in. But as we read through the Gospels, we see how so often he takes his disciples out into the world. And much of what they learn through experiment and through experience. This is beautiful. So Jesus is walking along, and he's not just teaching them about compassion for the poor, but Jesus stops and he looks, makes eye contact with someone, and he pulls his disciples into that as he touches someone who was seen as untouchable in the world. It's one thing for Jesus to say that on the hillside. It's different for them to see it in action. And discipleship requires that. Discipleship and mission happening together in community. And there you go. Double helix, right? The DNA of the church. Now here's another challenge. A lot of times when we begin to build our discipleship structures and our discipleship plans, then we design them around getting people involved in the life of the church, right? So the goal of discipleship is to get somebody to show up at church and then to get them into a small group. And then if they answer enough right questions in a small group, we let them lead a small group. And then we get them into more volunteer roles, and then we put them on the board. And before you know it, we're giving them a key to the church because they spend so much time there. Now that's important for us to get people connected to the life of the church, but that is not the full scope of discipleship. And if this is what our strategy looks like, then we are missing a major part of it. As we look at the approach of Jesus, we see this. He calls us as disciples to follow him, to take up our cross, right? So we have the call of discipleship to come follow Jesus. And then we have the cost of discipleship to lay down our lives and take up the cross. And then we have the commission of discipleship. He sends us out on mission to make more disciples. And when we're moving out on mission and engaging with mission, then more disciples get made, and then the whole process starts all over again. And we see that it becomes this exponential movement, and that can keep rolling out and rolling out and rolling out. This is what movement looks like. It's not a movement just to gather a crowd for our events. Please stop calling that a movement. That's just marketing. Movement is when it rolls out beyond us. Movement is when it's inspired by the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit filling up believers and driving them out into the world on mission. That's what that looks like. This is the DNA of the church. This is who we've been from the beginning. Missional discipleship is not a new idea. It's not a new idea. It is our root idea of who we are as believers, who we have been called to be, the called out ones. That is what it looks like to be the radical church.
Hey Matt, it's so great for you to be here live with us. I love that video, man. I'm so glad that this is going to be available on YouTube after the conference, because I'm going to have to rewatch that video a number of times. Hey, a couple questions to start off with.
Yeah.
How do you build being on mission into what you do? So how does someone start at your church?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think a lot of times in the church we use this mantra of go big or go home. But from our beginning, we wanted to take on the motto of go small and go home. And the meaning of that is we start small and we start really localized. We start with ourselves. And I think that's the way change really begins to happen. It happens at that grassroots level, and then it can influence the structure of a church. And so, what I would encourage churches who are looking to start small on that of ways to be engaged with mission. One of the things that we've done is we've challenged every one of our small groups once a semester to create and carry out some type of love mission, some type of way of going into the community and expressing the love of Jesus in a tangible and creative way for people who are outside of the church. And when people start to take that on themselves, that could even start, if it's too much to start with your small groups, you could even start just as a whole church and say, once a semester or even just twice a year, we're going to do this intentionally. And as people get engaged in that, there's something contagious about them activating their faith in that way and getting outside of the church, serving their community. And the gospel comes alive in a different way for them. Then it gets in the roots of who they are, and they want to continue to do that.
Yeah, it's sort of like I think you and I were talking before, and it said something like it pumps up the missional impulse of the church. Like they just want to do it again.
Yes,
so
exactly.
That's really exciting. So there's still things like orthodoxy, correct information, doctrine. I mean, those are still all incredibly important. And so I guess one of the questions I had too is how do you kind of create a balance and make sure those who are going out, those who are leading these movements, I mean, how do they have good teaching, good information along with the mission?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question, and it's really important. Orthodoxy is crucial, of course, and so it means right belief. And I think the way that you measure right belief is not by what somebody knows. Right belief isn't just having the right information. The way you measure right belief is how a person lives that out in their real lives, right? And so the teachings of Jesus, we immerse ourselves in that. We organize who we are around the person of Jesus. It all flows out of that. But we realize that when Jesus is teaching, he's never just teaching towards information. He's always teaching towards that end goal of active obedience and life transformation because of that truth. And so truth isn't just something that we grasp mentally. It's important for us to do that, but then it works its way through our lives and begins to transform who we are. So I think that comes back to John Wesley, too, this Oxford intellect, right? Just a brilliant mind. But people often say that Wesley was not a systematic theologian. He was a folk theologian, which they intend that as a bit of a dig against him. But I think that's a badge of honor. Like, I hope we are all folk theologians because that word folk means of the common people. And so we don't get this picture of Wesley just sitting at a desk in his office, just writing, paper and pen. But instead we get this person on horseback who's out engaged in the community. There's like dust all over him. And so I love that. Wesley's theology, we see it get played out in Wesley's biography. Yeah. And so that's something that we really try to stress, is to become folk theologians, people who we see real change happening in the real lives of real people.
Wow. One of the questions I had, too, about your presentation, and it was just phenomenal. Thank you for filming that. How is this reproducible? So let me just give you a scenario. Someone comes to Love Chapel Hill, and they're simply attending. Now, how do they go from attending to leading in this discipleship process that you have at your church?
Yes, awesome. So first of all, I'd say that word reproducible is really important because what we were talking about there is this idea of DNA. And DNA is reproducible, right? And so what we're not looking for is just necessarily cloning. We want to have children, not make clones, right? And so something that as that DNA is passed down and works out, is it begins to express itself in different ways, okay? So we keep that DNA really simple: discipleship, mission, and community. We don't tie it to a style. We don't tie it to a personality. We keep it rooted in that DNA of the church, because then it can express itself in so many creative ways based on where that gets planted. It can be very localized because of that. So, and for us in our local context, our church is made up of about 50% college students. We're in Chapel Hill, the home of the University of North Carolina. Go Tar Heels. And so we're about 50% college students, and then a lot of young families, young professionals, academics, activists. And then another large part of our population are men and women who are experiencing homelessness. And so that's about 10 to 15% of our church congregation. And so we had to create a path where it became very simple and clear for people to get plugged in with this and then to be able to naturally act this out. So our discipleship path it begins with church, right? And being a part of that larger community, something that's larger than yourself. So it begins with church. And then we have something called the story, where we walk people through the life of Jesus and the mission of the church so that they're rooted in that. And then the next piece is small groups, where they're in that more community environment. And then we really emphasize love missions. And so these things where we encourage people to go out, find creative ways to carry that out on the street, in our community, whatever their local context looks like for them on a daily basis. And the last piece is something we call Love Lab, which is individual, kind of personal spiritual disciplines that we encourage people in. So I think one of the most encouraging ways that gets played out is that we have, over the course of about 6.5 years that we've been meeting, we have really been convicted, because at the beginning we saw our mission as reaching out to our homeless friends. And over the last few years, the Holy Spirit has convicted us so much as our homeless friends have stepped into places of leadership and serving. And we realize it's not us reaching out to them, but it's them serving alongside of us, them using their gifts as well and living into their calling. And I absolutely love that. I love the way that some of our very best volunteers are men and women who are living in a shelter or living in a tent or living on the street. But this is their church. Right. And so we often say we don't have a college ministry. We don't have a homeless ministry. We have a church family where people are together in that. Everybody has a place where they can serve and where they can lead.
Cool. We have probably about 60 seconds, but we have some questions coming in and want to throw at least one out to you. Rob Garrison asks, and this is dealing with missional discipleship and informational discipleship. Yeah. He asks a question, this kind of goes along with what you're saying with Wesley, the Oxford, kind of the intellect things, I think. But it says, doing the missional discipleship instead or alongside informational
alongside. So it's like this. One of the phrases that we always use is, it's got to go beyond lecture and into the lab. Okay? And so obviously there's that beginning place. Acts chapter 2, it says that the early church devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching. So we have to be rooted and established in the word and in the teaching of that. And then we have to give people the opportunity to experiment with that teaching and to live out that teaching. And so it's lecture and it's lab, but it can't just stay lecture.
Cool. And one last question is, is it possible for someone who is an actual Duke fan convert being a North Carolina Tar Heel fan? Is that actually possible?
Not possible.
Not possible. If they did, would they actually be losing their salvation?
That is definitely true.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure. Okay.
Hey, let me just say this. It doesn't say anywhere in the scriptures that God cares about who wins a basketball game. But it does say very clearly that in the end, God will crush the devil with his
that's true. That's true. That's good. Well, how can people find you, whether social media or email, if they have questions about how to engage this type of kind of missional engagement when it comes to church planning and making disciples?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter at Matt LeRoy, and then I'm on Instagram at Matt LeRoy, also at Love Chapel Hill.
Okay.
for Instagram and Twitter, and also lovechapelhill.com.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thanks again
And
for being with
I
us.
don't Facebook very much at all, so please don't.
True. That's right.
Great.
Thanks again for being with us and taking the time.
Thank you.
It's awesome.
Thanks for doing this and for leading us in this.
Yeah,
This is great.
appreciate it. Thanks.
Yeah.
Tony
Yeah.
and Heath?